This is a production of Cornell University.
So yeah, I'll be talking about cover cropping rotations for weed seed bank management. And I guess I should give a little bit of an intro to myself. I'm Bryan Brown. I'm the Integrated Weed Management Specialist with New York State IPM, based out of Geneva, New York. I cover all different crops, fruits, vegetables, field crops, ornamentals, and recently added a community or landscape setting. So basically weeds in any setting is what I work on. I guess a fair amount of my background is related to kind of non-chemical alternative controls, like cover cropping, as well as cultivation, mulching, and some others. So yeah, I definitely view cover crops I guess within the context of weed seed bank management. And I guess a little bit of background on weed seed banks, because it's kind of it can be a foreign term. So weed seed banks are basically just the number and the different species and the number of seeds that are in your soil or in the soil of a given field. You can see here soil from 4 different fields, actually 4 different farms. And the 2 on the left were very weedy. And this is actually soil samples that I brought back to the greenhouse, laid out the soil in flats, and then watered over the course of the summer to encourage germination. And there's a big range in how weedy different farms are and different fields are, and most of that has to do with how persistent the management has been in not letting weeds go to seed. And that was definitely the case in these examples here. The farmers from the 2 fields on the right, really tried hard to prevent weeds from setting seed wherever possible. And so over time, the number of seeds in their soil, the weed seed bank, was depleted. And so that's kind of a preventative aspect, is not letting weeds set seed, but you can also do things to try to remove the seeds from your soil, even if there are already seeds there. And one of the best ways to do that is through a bare fallow or a stale seedbed period, in which you really try to encourage weeds to germinate so that you can come through and control them. And that basically just removes all of those seeds from your soil. So all those seeds would have germinated in your crop, if you hadn't done this final pass of weed control. So, a single pass like that is sometimes called a stale seed bed right before you plant your crop, your cash crop, or if you're doing a more extended, a longer period where you might come through a few different times and prep the ground to encourage germination, and then control any resulting weed seedlings with tillage or herbicides, then we'll call that a bare fallow. And that's, in my view, one of the best ways to decrease your weed seed bank. Here I have kind of put together a bit of a gradient in some different practices, and most of these are involving cover crops. But yeah, on the far right side of the screen there, in looking at ways to decrease the weed seed bank, I think probably a bare fallow is probably going to be one of the most effective ways, because the ground is bare. Most of our problem species like bare ground that can kind of stimulate germination through the sunlight hitting the soil. Some of that sunlight will actually reach the seed and tell them that it's okay, it's time to germinate. And also that sunlight will heat up the soil, and it will heat up during the day and it will cool down at night. And the seeds can sense that amplitude, that difference between day and night. And they say, okay, there must be bare soil. It's time for us to germinate. So when the soil is bare, I think you tend to get a lot of germination. And then on the other end of the spectrum here, of course, no management. If you've got just a weedy mess and all of those weeds are growing up 4, 5, 6 feet tall and producing thousands of seeds per plant, of course, that's going to add to your seed bank. But also cover crops. If you have a cover crop that does not establish successfully, and you just have to leave it for the whole season for whatever reason, there's going to be weeds in there, and they're probably going to outcompete in areas anyway, in patches, outcompete and grow over top of the cover crop and produce a lot of seeds. So even if you have a cover crop, it's not a done deal. You can still be contributing to your weed seed bank. And then next over in the line, a nearly weed-free, a long season cover crop, so a full summer, is one that has the potential to add a few weed seeds to your soil, and it's not gonna probably add significant numbers of seed. If it's a successful cover crop, it's gonna hopefully do a good job suppressing most of the weeds. But because it's a long season cover crop, if you're just putting something in for the whole summer, then because it have that long period with no management, there's a lot of weed species that have the ability to set seed within that period. So even if they're small, they may contribute to the seed bank to some extent. So for that reason, I have actually the most effective, in my view, way to use cover crops to deplete the weed seed bank is kind of a mix, is kind of using cover crops in between tillage or herbicide applications. And these kind of rapid fire cover crops never, I guess, allow enough time for weeds to set seed. And so any weeds that do come up with the cover crop, and inevitably there will be some or potentially many, you're going to terminate them before they set seeds. You're effectively taking them out of production. And yeah, so this highlights the example of weeds in your cover crops that you may not know they're there. This is from afar, and even actually from a pretty up close view, this looks like a very successful stand of buckwheat, and it is. But there will always likely be some weeds. This is pulling apart that canopy, and you can see some pigweed and some common chickweed down there, maybe some others. And yeah, these aren't anywhere near setting seed at this point, but it's important to scout and not just drive by the cover crops, but actually take a look at what's going on under that canopy, because sometimes, and this is a different field, sometimes there are weeds that are flowering and about to set seed. And in a weed seed bank context, you really want to try to terminate the cover crop before these weeds set seed. Okay, so you may be looking at this little Galansoga and think, well, okay, there's just one little flower on that plant, there's one little flower on the next plant, and yeah, I mean they're not going to produce these little seeds, these little plants that are under the crop canopy. They're not going to produce a whole lot of seed, but the question is, how much are they going to produce, and what the longevity of that seed will be, and how long you'll be dealing with it in your soil. So for example, for water hemp, common water hemp, tall water hemp, which we have in New York, which is becoming more problematic, is a very fecund species. It produces a lot of seeds, and up to 500,000. And so because it produces so many seeds, and I actually made a model here looking at what happens to that seed in the soil, and how many water hemp plants are going to be emerging per acre over time. And in the first half of this graph, the gray area is with no management. So assuming that you're not controlling the water hemp in years 1, 2, 3, up to year 4, and there's that kind of exponential increase as the population builds, and that third year it really put on a lot of seed. And then the transition from the gray to the white is where I start the simulation of what % control are you achieving of the water hemp per year. And I actually did this for herbicides, but it applies to cover crops as well. What % control are you achieving with the cover crop? If you're only, in this case, if you're only reducing the amount of seed that the water hemp is able to produce by 95%, then that's actually going to result in an increase in your weed seed bank, as shown by the dotted line there. If you're able to control about 98% of the water hemp, then you kind of stay at about a stasis or a stagnant level there, not really increasing or decreasing. But to really make some gains and benefit from the water hemp that is naturally going to die in the soil, which is about half of it every year dies just on its own, and then another good chunk of it germinates. And if you're able to kill all of those, you're really removing a lot of that seed from your soil. And so that bottom line, the black line, is if you're able to control 100% of it, which would be in the scenario of a cover crop that you're terminating before any seeds are produced, then you can really draw down your weed seed bank. You can really decrease the number of seeds in your soil. Okay, and so let's see. The species, now this is water hemp, and it does vary by species how many seeds are produced, and how long the seeds live in the soil. But species also differ by when they emerge out of the ground, and that can actually be something that you can help guide your management in your cover cropping. This is a graph of some work done in the Midwest, and we have a lot of these weed species, and certainly common ragweed is in common lamb's quarter some of our earliest emerging weeds, and you can use this. So here I have 3 different bars, A, B, and C, representing weeds. Say your problem weeds emerge in April or May is common in these parts for summer annual weeds. You can use this to adjust your management, to think about which crops you could use, or can you shift the planting of your crops to completely avoid that problem species. In this case, I have our cash crops here, but this could also work for cover crops, or you could place a cover crop in this short period. And looking at A, you could place a cover crop in that period before planting your crop to just have something covering the ground and producing all those favorable effects that we like from cover crops before you plant your cash crop, just as a means of delaying while you're waiting for this problem weed to emerge out of the ground, so you can come through and control it before planting. Some of our weeds emerge midsummer, not quite as many in the B column, but it's something to consider. You can look at these other shorter term crops or cereals to potentially avoid this section of weeds. And then C, these are mostly winter annuals down here on the bottom, some perennials or biennials, but yeah, and to avoid those, you can maybe try to plant a little bit earlier in the spring so the crop is well established and will be harvested before those weeds emerge. Looking at this a little bit differently here, and I should have explained that the kind of the dotted area is the timing of the weed emergence. The X's are either a tillage or a burn down herbicide application, and then the triangles with the vertical bars represent the crop maturity. And these are kind of the options for avoiding problem timings for weeds. You can delay here on the top. You're delaying the crop so that you can come through and till or spray and avoid a lot of that germination. Second one down, you can plant earlier to try to get a head start on the competition and get your crop up above it, especially if it's an early planted crop compared to the timing of weed emergence. But these down here on the bottom, I think, are even more effective. So if you've got a period here where the 3 X's are, if you can completely avoid that period. I mean, it's hard. It may be right in the middle of the season, so you're not going to do it every year. But once in a while, if you can set aside a month or 2 months and have a bare fallow in that period, you can really target the seed bank effectively. And the next one down just represents, you could put a cover crop in that period instead. Instead of all the bare soil and potential for erosion and runoff. Having a cover crop could establish a similar goal as long as it's terminated effectively at the end of that period. And then down in the bottom, some of you may say, hey, I've got weeds that are they're coming up year round. What should I do? And I've got a situation here where if you're able to take a full year off, you could potentially put in a rapid fire sequence of cover crops followed by termination that doesn't let any weed produce seeds. And I have them kind of spaced equidistant from each other here, but that might not be the best case, as I'll show you. Most of our summer annuals, here I have a little drawing from my notebook. Sometimes I like to do some things with pen and paper. A lot of our summer annuals emerge in May or so, and they'll run through the fall, producing a lot of seed, like you see in the picture here. And seed set and flowering starts usually in August. So if you were able to drop down to the next graph there, that's say you till or you spray in mid-August to kill all those initial weeds. Well, there may be a new batch of summer annuals that probably fewer, because they don't have that same drive to emerge later on in the summer, but there will probably be few, and they will also go forth and try to set seed here relatively rapidly, since fall is on the way and the days are getting shorter. They can sense that. So you come through and you tiller you spray, but right before that happens, and you drop down to the third one down. And then, well, okay, then there's these puny little summer annuals, like I've got this picture of the common lamb sporters here. Some of you have probably seen this, where it's, it's September or it's October, and you've got these little seedlings that are putting on seed because they can sense that the days are getting shorter, winter is coming, and so the time that you have to react decreases as you go through the season. 50, I think. Okay, so I'm actually running out of time, but I guess my main point with this is that if you're able to go for a full year of cover crops, it might look something like this, where you have a longer cover crop early on when those summer annuals aren't going to be putting on seed, and it gets kind of shorter and shorter that you have time to work with going forward.
Thank you very much. All right, happy to talk here. So, and thanks, Bryan, for a very good lead into what I'm interested in talking about here. So in using cover crops, there's a lot of different things that you have to think about to get everything to work together. Timing, seeds, species, all kinds of different things. And I want to talk about a mnemonic that's helpful, something that should be pretty easy to remember. And if you remember these 7 words, you know all the other things that it takes to get a successful cover crop going. So click on the right screen here. There we go. And here they are, your keys to success with cover crops. Number 1, a fast start. Number 2, no gaps. And number 3, kill on time. So there they are. So let me illustrate how you might use those 7 words. So let's start with a fast start. So here's an example of how to get a fast start. This is buckwheat, which is famous for a fast start. So with this one, at 4 days, we have green line. At 3 weeks, full cover of the ground. So Bryan was talking about how important it is to smother those weeds right away. This is why you need a fast start. In fact, I thought he had a great example there of the weeds showing up. That is, if your buckwheat takes 5 or 6 days to green line, you will have weeds germinating underneath them, just like in that picture. And if they're up in 4 days, you won't. It makes that much difference. Fast start, really, really important. Here's an example of buckwheat that went in the ground, but it was a little too cold, and it's coming up nicely. It looks good, but you look in between the rows of buckwheat, and lo and behold, there are other things. It wasn't fast enough. So this, from a weed suppression standpoint, this is a failed stand of buckwheat already, less than a week. And here's another example where the weed has a head start on our crucifer cover crop. So that is another example where it's not fast enough. In this case, the weed is growing fast because it didn't die completely. But nevertheless, that weed is going to do just fine. So if weed suppression is the story, getting the cover crop up faster is critical. So how do you do that? So this is where, so I hope I've convinced you, you need a really fast start. So all the things that get a seed out of the ground fast is what you need. So for one, you need quality seed. High quality seed is so much better than bad seed. It's a huge difference. And when you're planting vegetables, you pay a lot of attention to that. You don't want a poor seed lot. You want a variety that has naturally good vigor so that you get a good stand. Same thing with the cover crop. So carryover seed can be a lot weaker, seed that hasn't been stored well. Some seed producers, you can tell often by the tag, the germ, whether it's a good seed lot or not. So watch that, get good seed, pays off. Seed soil contact, again, this is basics of planting, but because you're usually trying to do the least amount of tillage before putting the cover crop in, you want to then combine that with the minimum it takes to get good seed soil contact. So the crumbly soil right around the seeds, the shallower they are, the faster they come up. Not very complicated there. The warmer the soil, the faster they come up. They need some moisture. Planting shallow into dry soil obviously doesn't work. Planting into the warm surface, but not being able to close the seed furrow doesn't work. You need all of those things. And you also need to have no live weeds. So the example I showed before, this guy where there was a live weed there, you don't want any of those. They should all be dead, dead, dead when you plant your cover crop. And in that case, it was alive, but it was under the ground, so we couldn't see it. But you know how that works. So these are all things that really are more or less second nature to most growers, and you just have to apply them with the cover crop to get a good fast start. Next up, no gaps. So I think Bryan showed some good examples of this too. Here's a buckwheat stand where we left basically one row unplanted so that we could keep our plots separate. And the weeds are bigger than the buckwheat. So the buckwheat grows well, the weeds grow even better. That's not a very big gap. And you can see that the weeds start growing right next to the buckwheat. So we find with buckwheat as an example, 6-inch row, really good. 7-inch row works well. 8-inch row, you start getting weeds. So it's right in there around 8 inches. That is the maximum distance between plants that you can have in a buckwheat stand. And so there's the gaps really matter. Those weeds that you see in this picture, they are cranking out the weeds. So if you're trying to suppress weeds, gaps like that are completely unacceptable. And you know, they happen for a variety of reasons. So you need to have a seed bed that's favorable everywhere. And you know, you can have wet spots and knolls and chunks of crop residue, all kinds of things that will create little spots where the seed bed isn't good and your cover crop will not come up fast or won't come up at all, and you'll get weeds instead, and then you have weed seed production. Getting uniform seed distribution is also important. It's relatively common to broadcast cover crop seeds. And in that case, you know, if there's a breeze blowing, you might get strips that are unplanted. If it's not throwing the seeds very uniformly, really going over a couple of times in opposite directions. Those are techniques you probably know pretty well by now, but it's really worth it to avoid having those gaps. And then finally, having a uniform seed depth so that they all come up fast, right? If the seeds are deeper, or if there are spots where the seeds go deeper, they don't grow well. If they're too shallow in spots. And you know, with the drills we've had, where just one of the drills was not going in the ground well, and lo and behold, there's a row of weeds right there instead. So those are all familiar things from crops that really apply to the cover crops. And then I want to finish up with the kill on time. And what is on time? So this one really matters a lot. There's a lot of different things you're thinking about in terms of what you're trying to get out of your cover crop. So one fairly common one is to get the right carbon nitrogen ratio. If you're growing for nitrogen purposes, you want a low carbon nitrogen ratio. You want a nice lush green, you know, mostly succulent lush leaves. That's what you want. You don't want something that's more mature than that. But if you're trying to have long lasting organic matter, then you want a high carbon nitrogen ratio. And related to that, getting the right durability. If you want it to be lignified and fibrous and last for a long time, then you want to be at one end. If you want it to be broken down fairly quickly, then you want little lignin and fiber development. I'm looking forward to Jean-Paul's talk on that particular point. You need time to decompose before the next crop. It's not that long, depends on the season, how long it's going to be, but then, and then the nature of what you're tilling in and what kind of seed bed you're going to need for planting your crop. So you need to think about that interval. The flowering of the cover crop is important. With most cover crop species, that's when they're easiest to kill. So that's one aspect, which is my next point. But it's also, you don't want weeds, or you don't want volunteer seeds of the cover crop. So the cover crop needs to not make seeds. That's really important for success, because they can be perfectly good weeds. Some of them are very effective weeds if you let them compete with your crop. But the susceptibility to the killing method. So it depends. I mean, there's lots of ways to kill cover crops, whichever one you're using. You want the growth stage of the cover crop to be appropriate for that killing method. We have an example of some of the spring grains are typically killed with glyphosate, but it has to be warm for glyphosate to work. So, and the spring isn't necessarily warm. So you have to wait until they're susceptible in order for that to work. So there's timing issues like that. Then often if you're trying to build biomass, you need enough of that. There's a whole bunch of other management constraints, but knowing what it is you're trying to do and when you need to kill it. So I'll show some examples. So here is, this is actually triticale, but it looks very similar to rye. And for planting a direct seeded vegetable with the winter cover crop, if you have it on for winter protection. So the maturity at the left is really a good killing time. That gives you succulent green material that breaks down easily. You can produce a good seed bed. You have enough time for it to break down. If you let it wait a little bit longer, and in this case, it's a couple of weeks, but if you go to the maturity on the right side there, now you've got a lot more lignified material. It doesn't break down very quickly. It will leave enough residue to interfere with planting, and it's not going to decompose very well. This is what it can look like. So at first glance, it seems like those beds are all the same. But the ones that were killed at Green Up on the 24th of April is the left half. And there you see the beds are forming pretty nicely. And there is very little residue. So we'll plant into those easily. On the right there, you see that there's some straw on top, and we're really having a lot of trouble getting the edges of the beds forming right because of the crowns of the rye. And so these were not covered with plastic, but if you were trying to cover these with plastic, that plastic would not stretch over the bed very well. It would be pretty uneven, and you really want to get that plastic taut. That would be tough to do on the beds that were killed at 10 inches. So thinking about that timing for various management purposes is really going to be important. And those stems grow fast. I just zoomed in on this one. So there's the stem starting to grow. It's only a couple of inches tall at this point. But in the springtime, it zooms, and your opportunities to get in there and kill it are often limited. So you need to be ready. Here's an example of forage rapeseed. We want this one to winter kill, but it was, so on the left is what it looks like in the fall. And some of them had started to bolt, which makes them susceptible to the frost, but some of them hadn't. There were some runty ones in the stand, and the runty ones were still rosettes. So they survived the winter. And so in the springtime, this is what it looked like. They're going to seed. There's not enough of them there to be useful as a cover crop. It's not going to make any biomass. The stand is not big enough to really suppress the spring weeds. I see some chickweed in there even. And it may even go to seed before it's dry enough for you to go in there and kill it. So you don't want that. So here's what we do want with winter killed crucifer. So this is good old tillage radish, and they're dead in the springtime here very reliably. The downside is that they actually die too early for recovering the nitrogen. The nitrogen pretty much leaks out of them by March, this time of year. So it's difficult to recycle the nitrogen from the spring with these. So that's another aspect where having them die this time of year is better. So some of the turnips will do that for us. Then another one, you want to avoid the regrowth and the volunteer seed. So here we're terminating a buckwheat stand with mowing. So mowing is the least effective way to kill it, but it works. So we're using that to really look at the sensitivity here. And so on the left, we mowed after 30 days, sooner than you would typically want to mow. 35 is really where you want to be. And so the lower nodes can still regrow. And so here, this is about a month and a half later that this is going into the fall. They've got seeds on them. They've got lots of seeds on them, probably enough to do a whole nother wonderful stand of buckwheat the following spring. You don't want that. If you wait too long, they will go to seed. And what we see when they were mowed at 45 days, there's actually fruit that are far enough along that they will mature. And so there are quite a few buckwheat seedlings already germinating in the fall, and there will be more in the springtime. So that's not good either. And at the bottom, you can see a little bit of a plant that was flattened by the mower. So it's, even though it's been horizontal now for quite a while, it's still making seeds on that plant also. So you want to get it when it's susceptible to being killed, not when it's going to regrow and not when it has already put viable seed on. So with buckwheat, I should say, when is it time to do that? You can put it on your calendar, 35 days after planting. Buckwheat also gives you a signal. What's the difference between the field on the left and the field on the right? Can you detect the subtle difference there? That is the buckwheat telling you time to get out there and kill it. Not too complicated. So I'll just repeat. How do you get a fast start? How do you avoid gaps in the stand? And how do you kill on time? So, so you have to know your goal. You have to have the right termination method suited to the goals. And finally, when you plant your cover crop, you have to know how and when it's going to die. So that sounds simple. It really goes against the grain of most people when they're planting, is they're not thinking about killing, they're thinking about growing, but know how and when it's going to die. That will be the way to have the most success. So I'm going to leave that slide up for my finale here and see if we have any questions on this one.
Thank you, Bryan, and thank you, Thomas. Those were two fairly great presentations, and I hope to be able to build on a lot of the things that you already shared. So regarding Crotalaria or sun hemp, and building on what Thomas said, what are your goals? Well, the goals, why I ever started growing Crotalaria or sun hemp was to have a cover crop that could build long-term soil health, because Crotalaria, or as many people call it, sun hemp, it implies in the name. It was used actually as a crop to make into rope, has a lot of lignin. So the idea that you can grow a cover crop that both fixes nitrogen, it's a legume, and also build long-term soil health was very intriguing to me. The question was, can we grow it? It's mostly a southern crop. It's a tropical crop, so it depends on where you are located if you actually can be successful in growing it. But I was intrigued, and so over the years I've been growing it on a smaller and on a larger scale, and I will be sharing with you what I've done. So first of all, how does it fit in the rotation? And how it fits in the rotation is because it needs warmth to germinate. It fits after early vegetables. So these are early greens, a top shot, or it fits right after a crop, a winter cover crop of rye. And then the question is for the grower, do I want to harvest the rye? There is time to harvest the rye, not maybe for seed, but for straw. In this particular case, it's cut when it is in full flower. Or for some growers that would like to not harvest the rye, you can cut it a few times until it is terminated, and then work that under. We've tried planting Crotalaria directly after the stubble of the rye. It's no-till with little success. We actually introduced a small bare fallow period right after the rye and had better success with germination. So here's an example. Actually, there's some of the other seeds that were mixed in here is some red-eyed peas. I have done a lot of different mixes over the years. I've made a lot of mistakes over the years, especially mixing in too much sorghum. And one of the problems with growing Crotalaria is that it takes a long time. And as was pointed out in the previous presentation, one of the things is you want a fast establishment so the other seeds don't come up. And when you do Crotalaria, 100% Crotalaria, the likelihood that other seeds will germinate as well is very high. So what are you going to be using as a complementary to the Crotalaria to make sure that there is enough shade and enough ground cover so the other weeds don't have a chance? And I've tried millet, I've tried sorghum, and red-eyed peas, and also sunflowers. And what I actually came up with, that a mix of 60 pounds of Crotalaria, 5 pounds of sunflowers, and 20 pounds of sorghum. Even 10 pounds of sorghum might be enough. So the question is also to the grower, what kind of wheat pressure do you have? What kind of a wheat seed bank do you have? And the more of a wheat pressure you have, I would say the higher amounts you would want of the sorghum and the sunflowers. The sunflowers and the sorghum establish very quickly. And again, I cannot emphasize enough that you do want your soil to be above about 60 degrees. So here is after a couple of weeks, you can see the sunflowers in this field. You actually don't see the Crotalaria in this field at all. It seems like it's all sorghum and it's all sunflowers at that stage of the game. This is probably the beginning of August. Even a little bit later, you can see here, I can maybe point my, here is some Crotalaria. It's lurking underneath. Now, if you have a good establishment, there are very few weeds underneath here. And the reason why is because we use shade as a means to repress any kind of development of weeds underneath. And as you know, that most of the summer weeds are able to establish them very, very large and easily, like when we talk about lamb's quarter or red-rooted amaranth. So I think these are the kind of things whereby you need to make sure that you have that early establishment so you don't see these weeds peeking up there. Later on, the Crotalaria start growing, and now the sunflowers are in full flower, which also actually makes for a very nice and colorful cover crop. The birds really enjoy going to a cover crop like this. This actually this tractor is at the same height as the cover crop. So this is a very tall cover crop. It's a way to bring a lot of organic matter into your soil. Now here we see a September picture. Now we see the sorghum kind of like dying down. The sunflowers are hardly visible. And now the crotalaria really, it comes into flower, and it's almost like a surprise how it emerges out of the cover crop itself. Now, the next question, of course, that Thomas already framed, how are we going to terminate it? Well, you can break your mower trying to mow that down. And we are not going to try to mow that down until the frost has killed the entirety of this crop. And the reason why we don't break our mower when we wait until after a good killing frost is because we have removed the water out of the crotalaria and out of the sorghum and the sunflower, allowing us to much easier mow this crop or to actually turn it into smaller pieces. We're not going to try to till this into the ground. It's just too much work. It really doesn't help much to try to do this. So we leave this as a ground cover, as a mulch over the winter. When we come back in the spring and the snow has melted, this is what we're finding: a very relatively dense cover of stalks, a lot of lignin, as you can see. And even then, it's going to be difficult to imagine planting a vegetable directly into this ground. Again, we won't do that. We will just try to borrow somebody's no-till drill and try to drill peas directly into that. If you have a problem with termination of your cover crop, then I would say you stick with strictly peas and you don't mix in the oats. Mixing the oats, again, gives you a little bit better competition with any kind of weeds that might emerge in that spring ground. But that's what we do then. And we're planting that directly in there. And then through the mulch, the oats and peas will emerge. I've also done some experiments with mixing in bell beans. If it wasn't for the cost of bell beans, I really enjoy growing the bell beans in there. Bell beans are not very good at suppressing weeds. The peas and the oats are much better at doing that, and they quickly emerge. But I do like the ground that the bell beans leave. And here again, we see this, what that looks like. And over time, and it grows up, and there's really no weeds there. And then when it is time, we mow the oats and peas down and incorporate that. And then, of course, we're already by the beginning of June. So we have already missed the window to plant early vegetable crops. And what is really surprising about planting the oats and peas and working them under when they're relatively succulent still, they're just about to go into flower, is that for some reason that I cannot explain, most of the material that is underneath the oats and peas has disappeared. You look underneath there and all the remnants of the crotalaria and the sorghum and the sunflower have been absorbed by the microorganism in the soil. They found a very wonderful environment living underneath the cover of the oats and peas, and decomposed most of these very lignaceous cover. And then we're following that with, say, a crop of fall brassicas, which could be fall broccoli, could be cabbage, could be cauliflower. And what is interesting about this is that we had one time the graduate students of Dr. Lori Drinkwater come out and measure the biomass that was developed after the oats and peas, and about between 150 to 200 pounds of nitrogen was turned into the soil. And this is also speaks to our experience, is that when we make sure that we do this all correctly, we actually don't apply fertilizer on a crop like broccoli or cabbage or cauliflower. It is not, we don't need it after a rotation like that. One of the things that I will say about doing this successfully is that I cannot emphasize enough the points that have already been made in the previous presentations, that you do need to make sure that the crotalaria is drilled correctly in the soil, but also that you, and the point I want to add to that, at the right temperature, but also that you are testing your soil to make sure that it is in optimum condition. So we're actually looking at making sure that our soil is already in optimum condition, even for broccoli, in the previous year. And so when we apply any nutrients as needed, we can actually do that directly after or before after the incorporation of rye, or before the incorporation of rye, or we've done that before the planting of the spring vegetables. So we are looking at our nutrient requirements way before then. And of course, they're being recycled in the soil, but not removing anything. And they then continue to be available for, now, when we want to follow that with another crop, we can follow after this, after a bare fallow, as Bryan pointed out, I have an additional bare fallow there. We follow with a crop of buckwheat, and then in the fall we'll plant garlic. So there are a number of different options. So here, as summary, year spring we can do the rye, early leafy greens followed by a short bare fallow, drilling of crotalaria mix, late fall, and we're talking here really about November, the mowing of the crotalaria, year 2 drilling of the oats and peas, year 2 summer incorporation of peas, and bare fallow, followed by fall brassica, or alternatively followed by buckwheat, to again, to really flush out your the weeds in this wheat seed bank. And then after the incorporation of buckwheat, you can follow that then with a late planted crop of garlic in September. And if there's any questions, I think I have time for that.
Great. Yeah, a few minutes for questions. Nice job. Really cool. Steve asks, do you need a specific inoculant, soil inoculant, for the sun hemp?
Yeah, you do actually. Now I forget which one it is. And thank you for mentioning that. That is very, very important, that you do have the right inoculant in order for both peas and the crotalaria to work. But so talk to your seed supplier and make sure that they're supplying you with the correct inoculant.
And John Paul, are you happy with this, with the crotalaria? Are you going to continue with it, or is it too challenging?
No, I mean, as long as you have the equipment to mow it. And we have not done it for, I did not, when I moved to Philia farm, I left the no-till drill at Roxbury. And now we are able, USDA was able to buy a no-till drill. So now we can again incorporate that. So having access to that is really important. So I also encourage growers to contact the local USDA office and see if they can apply for a grant to obtain a no-till drill. To be able to, bare fallow is really important, Bryan. But sometimes you want to be able to plant a crop without tilling.
Absolutely. Yep. Fantastic. All right. Well, great. Well, thank you, Jean-Paul, and
Very
I'll
welcome.
switch over and
Thanks for the invitation to be here today, Brian, and it's an honor to be one of a number of speakers here that I would say know much more about cover crops than I do. I'm going to share some of my experience with cover crops, specifically in plasticulture vegetables, so vegetables that are grown on plastic mulch. That could include biodegradable mulch. And oftentimes in these settings, we call that cover crop a living mulch. So sometimes we might say cover crop, sometimes we might say living mulch. It means the same thing in this context. And I'm not going to be able to stick around for our final speaker today. I did review Thierry's presentation. So you have the opportunity as the audience to kind of compare and contrast two separate experiences with this approach to using cover crops in vegetables or in plasticulture vegetables. So let's start with the why of using living mulch. Why would you do this? This is hopefully a video that you're going to be able to see of onion harvest in the Elba area of New York State, if the video loads. And while we wait for that to load, I want you to try to look at that field. There's almost no onions in that field. We're going to skip this. Or excuse me, almost no weeds in that field. The reason being, when you have a large field of onions without any plastic mulch, you do have a number of herbicide options that are quite effective. Those herbicides really, even on a conventional small scale vegetable farm, aren't a commonly used tool because they're specific to onions and don't have a lot of other applications. They're very expensive. The herbicides also, when they're used in plasticulture situations, may damage our crop. Here you can see some onions grown on silver and plastic mulch. There was an herbicide used here. You can see it did a great job at controlling those weeds. Now, when the farmer went through to pull these onions, all they got was a handful of tops because the bulb stayed in the ground because of misapplication of herbicide. Now, another reason to think about living mulch instead of herbicides. This is a bicycle in my home county of Yates County. And this is a jug of herbicide being carried ironically by a Little Debbie snacks cardboard box. Now, what happens to that bicyclist if he or she wipes out and that herbicide spills all over them and all over the road? What if that herbicide was something that was very toxic? So just a few thoughts. So what we decided to do was look at a way to grow cover crops because of these reasons I just shared between our beds of plastic mulch. We're somewhat addicted to plastic because of the weed control and the moisture retention that it provides right on the row, the additional soil heating, but wanted to get away from those herbicides. So we initially began working with rye, cereal rye, and I know that our next speaker will also mention this. Why are we using rye? Rye is an outstanding competitor. It's an inexpensive seed. And if we sow that as a living mulch in the spring, it won't form a seed head. It needs a winter time to trigger that seed production. So it stays vegetative and is an outstanding competitor. So let's see. Our initial seeding date in our research was April 10th. And our initial crop that we were looking at was sweet onions, so large bulb onions. Unfortunately, in our first year research, we then had maybe 3 or 4 inches of snow and freezing temperature. And the weeds or the rye seed interpreted that as wintertime. And so it produced a seed head. So there is a risk here that this will go to seed. And then you have a field like this, which is a mess. Some farmers responded to that by using herbicides to control the rye or living mulch between those beds of onions, specifically Roundup. That is a legal use, and our following speaker will go into greater detail on the use of herbicides to control living mulch. But we weren't looking to kill our cover crop or our living mulch. We wanted to keep it alive. And this is what it might look like in an ideal situation. This is just simply cereal rye. We lay our beds of plastic, and before we transplant or make any transplant holes, in this case for tomatoes, we want to scatter or broadcast that rye over top of the entire field. And then if we need to, maybe we're going to sweep off that plastic, maybe the wind's going to take that seed off that plastic, but we don't want the cover crop seed getting into our transplant holes or it becomes another weed for us. As you can see, rye is an outstanding competitor. And one of the research questions is, does it compete with our vegetable crop? And here you see a living mulch of rye between rows of tomatoes. Really, this is a rye field with a few tomatoes in the, on plastic beds. What we found was that in a wet spring, that rye will indeed stay vegetative, but it will grow quite a bit to the point where we need to manage it or mow it. So initially we thought we might reduce labor if we were to compare the living mulch to, say, cultivation, where that cultivation is with horses or a tractor or by hand. But in reality, there's probably not a labor reduction, or at least not a time reduction, because we need to mow this rye, particularly in a wet spring. You also then have an issue of when you mow that, however you mow it with a line trimmer or a riding mower, can you keep those rye clippings from off of a fruiting vegetable, say tomatoes or peppers? You can have a contamination problem. Over time, we also found that even though the rye stayed vegetative, it would eventually succumb to a disease called rust and foot traffic. And you can see that going on here with tomatoes. So let's see, this is looking at, I can't even see what it's looking at. I think we're looking at 1 square feet of row middle, and is it weight of weeds? And you can see that rye compared to our cultivation and herbicide plots was providing very good weed control. That rye, though, was apparently causing some competition with our onions that resulted in taller onions compared to cultivation or herbicide treatments. Unfortunately, boy, this is frustrating. I can't see my slide titles. Thrips. We didn't really see any difference in thrips, a common pest of onions, between these different treatments. Now let's talk about really what matters, yield. And unfortunately, we did see a major yield decrease where we had living mulch compared to our cultivation and herbicide treatments. In this case, we're looking at yield in pounds per 10 feet of bed. And you can see we were losing close to 20 pounds of onions over those 10 feet. Why is that? The cultivation and herbicide treatments compared to a living mulch had more colossal. A colossal onion is a size grade, so it's greater than 4-inch diameter bulb. We were getting more colossals and more jumbos in our cultivation and herbicide treatments than rye. So why is that? That's a question that remains to be answered, but I imagine a lot of it is competition for water and competition for nutrients. So we noticed that farmers were toying with other species of living mulches, one of those being clover. Here it looks like a type of red clover between rows of tomato plants. So we began to incorporate clover into our research on cereal rye as a living mulch. This is our seeding rate. We were looking around 150 pounds of rye or grain to 15 to 20 pounds of clover. And we also began including barley in our work. So we lay out our plots again. And one of the things we found was that living mulches do exceedingly well where we're using row cover for temperature protection in the spring or pest protection in the spring. And it might do a little bit too well. And so in this case, that living mulch was growing and competing with our pepper crop, and we were unable to mow it because it was underneath that row cover. So this is cumulative weed biomass on a square foot basis. And what you'll see here is that the plots that included both a winter grain such as rye or barley in combination with clover had the least amount of weeds compared to a winter grain alone or compared to cultivation. conservation, which we all know is never perfect. So this was a positive result for us, incorporating clover into the living mulch over time. Unfortunately, where we had more living mulch, we were still seeing a yield loss on a row foot basis where we had that clover treatment. A quick anecdotal experience I'll share when using a living mulch is that its effectiveness in controlling weeds depends not just on the principles that Thomas shared with us earlier, which are outstanding, but also on your weed species. So here's one of our cooperating farms in the Hudson Valley that was growing peppers, and their primary weed species was crabgrass. And crabgrass competes just fine because it can be mowed or it can grow underneath a living mulch and then spread out and produce a seed head on plastic. So if grasses are your primary weed species, this may not be the best weed control technique. Now that ground cover over time, this is where the clover really began to shine. So you can see the red bar portion of the bar here is our cover crop or living mulch. The blue portion is the weeds. And this is in June 12th. Moving forward to, where am I now? About a month later, July, you can see that the rye clover in particular, the row middle is almost all cover crop, very little weed. So that was providing outstanding weed control for us. And over time, that continued to be one of our better treatments. Here we are in September. So if we want long-term weed suppression using a living mulch, the clover has greater longevity than the rye or the barley alone. The rye and barley, however, allow that clover to have a good start. It really promotes its germination and early growth. So that combination is probably the best in our treatments. I'm just checking my time. So when it comes to cover cropping, it's a bit of an art and science. And I like to say that this picture is really a work of art. You can see some buckwheat here in the background that Thomas would tell us it is time to control that. It's in flower, attracting a bunch of wonderful beneficials and pollinators. Over here to the left, we've got some sort of vegetative, it looks like a grain. And then in the row middles here, the farmer is growing a vetch. I think this is either hairy or purple vetch. And then we have these peppers on bare ground in the center of all those cover crops. This is indeed a work of art. However, we are not in the art business. We're in the vegetable business. So my message is cover crops can indeed be competition for our vegetable crop. And in this case, these peppers yielded almost nothing. But it was a beautiful piece of art, a lot of beautiful cover crops. My take-home messages in this very rushed presentation today: the problems that we found in year 1 of grain senescence from foot traffic or rust really became an attribute in years 2 and 3 of our research because we moved to incorporating clover, and that clover provided long-term weed control. Those living mulches for us did reduce onion bulb size. It reduced total pepper yield. And since rye is a grass, it attracted armyworms, which are a grass pest, to our tomato plots. So we had increased armyworm pressure there. Total tomato yield was lower where we had rye as well. So combined with rye and clover or barley, most effective at controlling yields, may or may not, depending on what you're growing. So a few other comments I'll have in my last couple minutes here. There are benefits that are hard to quantify when it comes to living mulch. And these are benefits that farmers have shared with me. One of those is after a rain, they can go out and harvest whatever that vegetable crop is and not get muddy. That field is going to absorb water much better. And we're obviously reducing surface erosion. That wasn't one of our research questions here, but we hope that it's one of the benefits of our work. So we're reducing erosion and we're improving harvest or labor conditions. excuse me. We're also improving those harvester labor conditions. This may sound trivial, but it's nicer to kneel down on a living mulch than it is on bare soil and rocks. And it takes much less of a toll on the knees of the harvesters if you're harvesting on your hands and knees. So those are a couple of other benefits. I think the combination of a living mulch with a biodegradable plastic film or degradable plastic film also can fit into a reduced tillage program, which again was beyond the scope of our research here. But I like that we're moving towards a production system where right now the only plastic in the field is our drip irrigation tube. So then we could sow a second cover crop in those bare row middles if we're using a degradable film over top of the vegetable beds. So I'm going to stop there. It looks like I have about 4 minutes for questions. I'd be happy to answer
Thank you, Judd. Excellent presentation. Any questions for Judd? Just type them into the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. Oh, I think I see a question from Thomas. I'll read it out. How do you manage the edges of the plastic? That's where the cover competes the most, he says.
Yeah, great question, Thomas. So it's going to be dependent, but in a wet spring where that winter grain or that is really growing quickly, we have to mow it, and probably a line trimmer or weed whacker is going to be most effective at getting those edges. You're probably also going to tie up your or rip up your plastic a little bit. In a drier year or a year where you have rust, or it's a crop where you have a lot of foot traffic, it kind of keeps that rye at bay, and it probably never has to be controlled. And the clover in general, we're not mowing. And I should have mentioned which species of clover we're using. We're using a Dutch white clover. And we went with a Dutch white clover compared to some other clover species because it's, I would say it has moderate vigor. So it's ideally not competing. It establishes itself well, but not quite as vigorous as some of the red clovers or other ones. So Dutch white clover was what we looked at.
Judd, is your sense of it that there is a solution with using living mulch where you have the living mulch that suppresses weeds but doesn't compete with the crop? Is that a unicorn that we're trying to find?
Great question, Brian. So farms that are using soluble conventional fertility might be able to overcome that competition, whatever it is. So I think further research we would want to look at, is it water or is it nutrients that the cover crop is causing competition? And if it's so, then can we respond to it? Since we have drip tape there, we can provide both. We can provide additional fertility and additional water. So that might be the unicorn. We just got to figure out which of those it is.
And then which rye was it? What type of rye?
Yes, a cereal rye or winter rye, not ryegrass. So it was a cereal rye or a winter rye. And again, we're applying that in the spring. As soon as our field is fit, our plastic is laid, but we don't have any transplant holes yet.
Thank you, Bryan, for the introduction. And it's great to be with you today, even if it's just online. But I'm glad to be able to share some of little tidbit of the research we did on that we are still doing on cover crop in veggies, especially in plasticulture. So what is our current weed management context if we are looking at what's going on in the weed science world? Clearly, we need to get more integration of non-chemical options. Right now, I mean, we know that for some herbicide, integrating non-chemical option may be helping us to improve herbicide performance. We have an increasing issue with herbicide resistance, and it's not just something which is restricted to soybean or corn. That's something that is affecting us as well in veggies. If I look at New Jersey, I mean, you have soybean field, we have corn field. On next to it, you have a veggie field. On Palmer Amaranth, doesn't know the boundary between this field and can really be a problem in veggies as well. And if you're looking at what went through the pipeline, the herbicide pipeline over the last few years, I mean, we didn't get any new herbicide mode of action or site of action exactly for the last 30 years. So clearly, that's a big stimulus for really finding some new non-chemical option for improving herbicide control. So how those cover crop can really help with weed management? Well, the first one is really competition, direct competition for light, nutrients, water. When these cover crops are growing, especially in a dense stand, they can really outcompete many weed species. When we are terminating the cover crop, we can really create, depending on the amount of biomass, of cover crop biomass we are able to produce, we can really create a physical barrier that will really prevent some of these weeds just to emerge. On the last one is when we are terminating this cover crop, especially when we are using herbicide for terminating cover crop, we may eventually integrate residual herbicide at the same time for extending the weed control that cover crop may be providing in crops. So some of the impact, some of the cover crop impact on weed life cycle, I really like this picture because it's really showing that cover crops are impacting every part of the weed life. You can have physical suppression that will really prevent seedlings to grow. You can have competition, I mentioned that before. You can have allelopathy, which is chemical inhibition. I mean, some of the cover crops that we are working with can really release some chemical in the soil that can eventually help suppressing weed emergence. Cover crop can host natural enemies that can cause some predation on seed, on the seed bank. You can modify the microenvironment and make it less favorable for weeds to grow, and especially for seeds to survive over time. So you have a range of different actions that cover crop can really have on weed life. That's just an experimentation we did a few years ago in northern New Jersey. Actually, we're comparing two different cover crops. We're looking at Sudan grass and we're looking at sun hemp, the crotalaria that Jean-Paul mentioned a little bit earlier. So we grow this cover crop for 1 year. On the next year, we follow up with a crop, and we follow up with cabbage. And what was interesting to see in this plot was really looking at the differential effect of Sudan grass and sun hemp on Erigedinsoga emergence. And really, I mean, I was really impressed to see that Sudan grass, maybe because of the allelopathy effect, was really helping reducing the density on the biomass of Gedinsoga the following year. If you look at the visual, that's something that was taken the next year. So 1 year after terminating the cover crop, you can still see a visual difference in the number of Gedinsoga that are emerging in these fields. So that's something to consider. Sudan grass was really helping us with suppressing Erigedinsoga emergence. Cover crop biomass, we mentioned it today, but that's really a very important topic. We tend to consider that the more cover crop biomass we have, the better it is. But it's not just that. It's also looking at the quality of the biomass that we are producing, especially if we need to look for cover crops that can really produce lignin in the stem, because over time, this lignin, this lignified stem will really degrade more slowly. Cover crop decomposition, that's just a follow-up with the previous slide, but clearly if you're looking at pure rye, which is containing a lot of lignin, clearly, I mean, you will have a 50% mass reduction after 170 days. If you compare that to veg, you will be around 53 days, and a 50% mix will be around 91 days. So clearly the one that can really provide longer physical protection barrier over the soil for preventing weed emergence will be a better cover crop specifically for weed management. Looking right here at the effect of planting on termination date of cover crop, and that's the work that Stephen Mirsky did at Penn State when he was still at Penn State. But clearly, I mean, if you're looking at at a cover crop that will be terminated on May 30, so the green dots, the planting date is really important, because if you plant it by September 15 compared to October 15, that will make ultimately a big difference in terms of biomass production. And we know that this biomass production is really essential for weed control. If you're looking at termination, something that you're terminating between either May 1st or May 30, and that has been planted at the same date on October 15, you're looking at a difference of 6,000 pounds of biomass, of cover crop biomass between these two termination dates, between May 1st on extending the cover crop up to May 30 will really provide you with more biomass that can be useful for weed control. So cover crop, some of the challenges that we have with cover crop for integrating cover crop in vegetable production, especially in plasticulture, well, acceptable weed control in plasticulture vegetable system can be extremely difficult. That's one of the challenges we have with this system too. We have fewer herbicide options that are available in veggies compared to corn and soybean. So the choice of herbicides that we can use to go eventually with a cover crop, not to go with a cover crop, but the type of herbicide that we could use for really getting good control between the rows of plastic is really limited. So that's another advantage for eventually considering integrating cover crop into the system. Cultivation and on-weeding can add increased environmental and economic cost. On cover crop seeded in between, cover crop seeded in between plastic rows may provide an additional weed management tool. We can supplement eventually herbicide weed control by integrating cover crop between these plastic rows. We did some experimentation in the past, especially with University of Maryland. We collaborated with them on a project with watermelon. We were just working with cereal rye at this time, and we observed that cereal rye biomass was really peaking before the watermelon started to grow out of the plastic. So that was a good indication that, yeah, when you're getting biomass accumulation peaking before the watermelon starts growing out of the plastic, you're really getting some type of beneficial effect on weed management as well. Something that we didn't test at this time was really trying to integrate everything in single pass. Can you get a single pass of herbicide eventually for terminating the cover crop, controlling the weed that have still emerged at this time, and eventually including a residual herbicide at this time? So just at the time when you're terminating your cover crop, can you have all your herbicide applied at this time for maintaining control over the rest of the season? So that's what we try to do. We started the experimentation last year. Again, that's a joint project between New Jersey and Maryland. We looked at evaluating the effect of cover crops management tactics on weed suppression, so looking at different type of herbicide. We evaluate cover crops for reducing herbicide application on looking at the environmental impact in plasticulture system. And we want this system to be also a good tool for growers for extension to demonstrate the utility of cover crops for weed management in plasticulture systems. So that's just the kind of design that we had last year and that we keep working on in 2022. So we had a different type of termination. So we were terminating the cover crop either with paraquat, clethodim, which is strictly a grass herbicide, or we had no herbicide at all. We tried to just roll the cover crop. We had three different types of cover crop. Actually, we had cereal rye, spring oats on a mix of rye and oats. And we had one where we didn't have any cover crop at all. And the last one was eventually adding a residual herbicide at the same time we are terminating the cover crop. So we added fomesafen on S-metochlor, or we just terminated the cover crop with either paraquat, clethodim, or rolling it without adding any residual herbicide. So we had two different crops. I was working on cucumber here in New Jersey because we have a lot of cucumber production in the state. Watermelon, that's really a specificity of Maryland. So Kurt Vollmer, my colleague working on this project, worked with watermelon. Our cover crop was seeded relatively early in the season, but in around mid-April, April 2, April 27. We seeded our cucumber in June 2nd, when the watermelon was transplanted in June 24. We terminated our cover crop in New Jersey on June 24, when the cover crop was terminated in July 14 for watermelon in Maryland. And definitely harvesting time is really different between cucumber and watermelon. we harvested around mid-July, when Kurt harvested watermelon in September. So when we were looking at some of the results, we get some, I mean, for a cover crop that has been seeded in spring, we get decent biomass accumulation. In New Jersey, the green bars, the best cover crop, the best biomass producing cover crop was rye, with almost 4,000 pounds per acre of biomass produced with rye. In Maryland, Kurt gets really the best biomass production with oats, with almost 6,000 pounds per acre of biomass, which generally considered to be the optimal biomass for really getting some weed suppression. If we're looking at smooth pigweed, so we look at different weed species, and smooth pigweed was one of the big weeds that we were looking for control. Clearly, before integrating any herbicide in the mix, we really get some decent control of smooth pigweed. If you're looking at in New Jersey, if you're looking at oat, rye, and oat plus rye, really the best mix was mixing oats and rye. That's provided clearly a suppression of pigweed emergence compared to the absence of cover crop. If you're looking at watermelon, Kurtz gets similar result again with getting a best result for pigweed suppression by mixing oats and rye. On that, something that is important, because again, I mean, I mentioned it before, but for us in Maryland and New Jersey, one of the big issue is Palmer amaranth, and we know that smooth pigweed, we didn't have Palmer amaranth in this field, but we know that smooth pigweed may be a good proxy for predicting what may happen with Palmer amaranth as well. So we are looking at late season smooth pigweed, and that was just done in Maryland. And again, I mean, Maryland, I mean, they extended their production up to September 16, when we were done by mid-July. So it's almost a 2 months difference between the two. And clearly for this kind of crop where your production is extended throughout the end of the season, it may be really important to really include a residual herbicide at the time of termination of the cover crop. And clearly for all the system, Kurt managed to show that including the residual herbicide was working great for really maintaining good control of smooth pigweed up to the end of the season. And in addition, if you're adding residual in addition to the cover crop, that's really the system that is providing you the best type of control. If you're looking at just no cover, just putting the residual herbicide, you're still getting more pigweed emerging by the end of the season compared to the system where you have the integration of cover crop with the residual herbicides. Looking at yield, clearly, I mean, when we didn't have any cover for both cucumber and watermelon, we really had significant yield reduction compared to our system with either oats, oats and rye. So really the cover crop really helped tremendously with weed suppression, and that's why it explains why we got this difference in cucumber and watermelon yield. Looking at some of the picture for our research, and it was on cucumber. So that was a spring oat and rye mix with no herbicide, and it was in around June 30. So almost 2 weeks before we start harvesting the cucumber. And you can really clearly see that, I mean, between the rows, you may see one weed at the front, but it's before we don't have any kind of control at this level because it's not within the plot, but within the plot itself, we are getting really decent, acceptable weed control without getting any herbicide. One of the challenges that we got with either rye or oats was really getting good growth of the cover crop along the plastic row. On that, the weakness of the system is that when we seeded the cover crop, we never really get a good connection in these maybe 3, 4, 5 inches along the plastic row. And that's where we got a lot of weed escape. And you can see right here, you can look at lamb's quarter. These lamb's quarter growing right along the edge of the plastic can tremendously impact yield because they are directly competing with the crop at this level. So between in the center of the row middle, we get excellent weed control. At the edge, where either the cover crop was not was not growing well, or either we didn't get enough herbicide at the edge of the plastic. That's where we got a lot of long squatter development. On my last picture is really to show you the type of weed pressure we had in this field, where we had no cover crop, no herbicide. You can look, it's amazing. It was a sea of common long squatter, and clearly in this spot, that explains why you don't see any, why you have such a big yield reduction, because these plants were growing taller than, they were up to 6 feet tall, long squatter, and they are shading the ground. Even if you have plastic, they were, providing enough shading of the plastic rows for really preventing any crop production. So I think it's a promising system, trying to integrate both, especially in situation where we have challenging weeds such as Palmer amaranth, where we know that the cover crop itself will not be sufficient. But I think it's a nice way of looking at things by trying to integrate herbicide and cover crop together. With that said, if I may have a few minutes for question, Bryan, so I'm here.
Absolutely. That was fantastic. Thank you, Thierry. Yeah, if there's any questions, you can go ahead and unmute or pop them into the chat.
Bryan, I saw a question regarding the way we planted a cover crop between the rows.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Actually, the way we did it is that we manually seeded all this cover crop, which was a tremendous work to do. We don't have a system yet for seeding that between the rows, but that's something that probably need to be developed over time. The other challenge that we got to was really rolling the cover crop between plastic is really tricky to do, and we were expecting that the herbicide sprayer would put enough weight for rolling down the cover crop. That was not the case, so we still have to think about designing a system where we can roll the crop a little bit better than what we did last year.
Great. Thank you, Thierry. And there's a couple awesome links that Thomas posted about various features of the different cover crops. I know there's so many, it can be hard to choose which cover crop is right for the best situation. And he put some great links for that in. And Steve posted our YouTube playlist where this presentation and some of the other, I think all of the other, or most of the other expo sessions will be posted as well.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.